A Great Argead Saga Alexein. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. Macalinaki. A new episode every single day. Episode 29. Aristotle Dissecting Intellect. Stagira, a Thracian city-state, the residence of Proxinus, early spring. Propelled by the raw frost of the northern skies, the fierce March wind whipped off the Thracian Sea to crash violently against the chalk-white precipices of Stagira. Fine sea spray snaked through the spaces in the wooden shutters, melting into a salty glaze upon the floor of a deeply peculiar sanctuary. It was less a scholar's study than a cold, merciless dissecting theater, or perhaps a chamber of specimens designed to strip bare the very essence of the world. Upon shelves lining the entirety of the walls, dried unknown seaweeds, bleached skulls of monstrous fish, and glass jars containing the plumage and viscera of various birds were displayed in orderly rows, bound by a discipline of death. At the center of the floor, upon a marble table, lay the slimy, gargantuan carcass of a squid, purchased but a few hours prior from a local fisherman. Before this carcass stood a 16-year-old youth, Aristotle. The youth's eyes harbored not a single shred of the romanticism that mediocre poets routinely discover in nature. His gaze was dark, wet, and filled with a terrifying, ravenous hunger for observation, as though he meant to scrape away the structure of his subject down to its very molecular components. With slender fingers that were dexterous to the bone, he gripped a sharp, bronze dissecting knife, a scalpel. The duct of the ink-secreting organ is situated directly beneath the stomach. Aristotle muttered to no one in particular, his speech remarkably rapid, marked by a characteristic, slightly lisping sibilance. Without a millimeter of error, he sliced a single straight line through the squid's mantle. The overflowing jet-black ink stained his fingertips, but the youth did not so much as blink. The structure of every living organism possesses a cause and atia. Nature creates nothing in vain. If so, what is the mathematical rationale that dictates the viscosity, the density of this mucus? The youth's brain utterly rejected the mere accumulation of knowledge. He thirsted for a single, colossal, universal law that would classify the world and encompass its entire structure. The doors of the tent, nay, the heavy oaken doors of the room, swung open and a man entered. It was Proxinus of Athenian, the youth's brother-in-law and current legal guardian. "Are you still conversing with that corpse, Aristotle?" Proxinus offered a wry smile, his brow furrowing slightly at the pungent raw stench of the sea and dying flesh that dominated the chamber. "I thought I had concluded all lectures regarding the meter of Homer's Iliad yesterday. Your sister, Aristotle, is likewise anxious over how you constantly confine yourself to this study, exchanging words only with the town's fishermen and elderly herbalists." Aristotle set down his dissecting knife and quietly wiped the ink from his fingers with a linen cloth. The gesture was characterized by a composure and cold detachment unbecoming of a 16-year-old. "Brother Proxinus, Homer's verses are admittedly beautiful. The wrath of Achilles resonates with true magnificence when writing the hexameter, the 6-foot meter. Yet that is merely a metaphor forged by the human intellect. What I desire to know is the human anatomy that conceives such metaphors and the structure of the gods' material, the elements that give form to this very world." Proxinus peered into the unfathomable abyss of intellect, lurking behind the youth's words, experiencing a sudden, flesh-crawling shiver of dread. This youth was too precocious, far too alien. A mere year ago, in 369 BCE, Aristotle's life had been violently severed in two by a sudden and monumental tragedy. His father, Nicomachus, court physician and irreplaceable confidant to the great king Amyntas III of Lower Macedon, and his affectionate mother, had passed away in rapid succession. Until then, Aristotle had been raised at the very heart of the royal palace in Pella, the Macedonian capital, a vortex swirling with the sense of power and blood. He had grown up watching the back of the assassinated Alexander II. He had run through the same gardens and studied the same geometry of tactics as a contemporary and salon companion to the Argead princes. Perdiccas, now a 17-year-old puppet king, and Philip, who at 14 had already played the part of a monster amidst the dust of battle. As the son of a court physician, he was a child who had had the doctrines of anatomy and observation thoroughly hammered into him by his father as a disciple of Asclepius, the god of medicine. That was Aristotle's true identity within the court of Pella. Yet, rendered an orphan by the demise of his parents, he was cast out of the royal palace and taken into this remote fringe of Stagira. Anxious that this seedling of genius should not end up as a mere doctor's boy, Proxinus had rigorously drilled him in Athenian rhetoric and literature. Nevertheless, the youth's essence had already been thoroughly encroached upon by both the structure of blood and governance he witnessed in the palace of Pella, and the mathematics of life he observed in the waters of Stagira. An ominous dispatch has arrived from the temporary Macedonian encampment, Proxinus said, extracting a letter of high-grade parchment and placing it upon the desk. It seems the pyre of the late King Alexander has concluded at Aegis. Ptolemy the regent has seized absolute power. Regarding those princes who were your childhood companions, Perdiccas has become a caged king, and the younger Philip is to be sent south to Thebes as a hostage. Though the boy is still trapped within Pella awaiting his exile, the house of the Argeads is now completely dismantled. Deep within Aristotle's eyes, a faint but violent spark of intellect flickered. Philip. To Thebes. The youth recalled the cold profile of the younger prince back in the gardens of Pella, staring fixedly at the movements of wild deer, with eyes the color of dead fish. Philip is not a creature destined to perish within a Theban cage. He will inevitably drain the very brains of that southern hegemon, absorbing the entirety of General Epaminondas's geometry. The anatomy of Macedon shall, once more, be reconstructed into the grander structure, the phalanx. Do you wish to return to that blood-drenched north, to Macedon, Aristotle? Proxinus inquired. No, 16-year-old Aristotle replied, shaking his head with absolute finality. His eyes were turned toward the ultimate apex of Greek intellect, far to the south beyond the mountain ranges of Thessaly. Macedon is currently nothing more than raw matter, materia, defined by blood and violence. It lacks the absolute form, the forma, required to govern it. I must go to the place where that form is refined to its absolute purest state in this world. Let me go to Athens, brother Proxinus. I wish to enter the academy, the school presided over by Master Plato. Proxinus exhaled a deep breath, looking alternately at the squid's carcass upon the desk and the youth's translucent gaze, utterly stripped of emotion. Athens, then? That place is currently mired in political filth. Yet there is no intellect left capable of hosting a monster such as you save for the brain of that old philosopher. Go, Aristotle. This autumn, around the time you turn 17, I shall arrange a vessel bound for Athens. You have my gratitude. Aristotle offered a brief but flawless bow, then once more took up his bronze dissecting knife. Macedon, where a clandestine pact had been forged, Thebes, where a blazing sun was ascending, and Athens, where the ancient order was poised to collapse. Upon the colossal game board called Greece, another pure intellect, a logo seeking to govern every law of the universe, was about to let out its first cry. The youth did not yet know that after spending 20 years dissecting the world in Athens, he was destined to shape the world-conquering brain of his childhood companion's son, Alexander the Great. Child of Philip, the very man who would one day return alive having plundered that Theban geometry. Without a shred of hesitation, the youth's scalpel plunged once more into the flesh of the squid. The deck of the Spear of Athena groaned under the weight of a heavy morning swell, the rhythmic slapping of waves against the hull, a stark contrast to the suffocating silence of the men. Ahead, the low, gray smudge of the Macedonian coastline began to resolve into jagged cliffs and salt-sprayed marshland. Iphicrates stood at the prow, his cloak whipping in the salt-heavy wind. His eyes were not fixed on the distant, shimmering spires of Pella, but on the raw, uninviting stretch of sand that bordered the gulf, a place where the sea met the mud, indifferent to the crowns of kings. A young commander, one of the few who had survived the chaotic skirmishes of the Aegean, stepped up to the railing, balancing against the violent pitch of the ship. He pointed toward the southern reach, where the mouth of the Lydias River signaled the entrance to the capital's harbor. The wind is holding, General, the commander called out, his voice fighting the roar of the surf. Shall we signal the fleet to turn into the channel? We could be docked at the port by midday, dry shot and ready for the march. He paused, his brow furrowing as he noticed the general's gaze remained fixed on the desolate, exposed beach to the north. Will we land in the port, General? He pressed, his confusion deepening. The harbor is the standard approach. It would save the men the slog through the surf and keep our phalanx tight. Iphicrates finally turned. His face was a map of old campaigns, weathered, etched with the scars of a dozen sieges, and carrying the calm, calculating mask of a man who viewed war not as a matter of honor, but of pure, cold geometry. The port? Iphicrates echoed, his voice flat and dry. He gestured toward the distant harbor, where the smoke of the ongoing siege still stained the air like a bruised thumb. Look at the terrain, Commander. If we sail into that harbor, we surrender our most precious asset, our mobility. We would be sailing into a funnel, trapped by the wooden piers, the narrow channels, and the marshy bottleneck. Pausanias is a scavenger, but he is not a fool. He knows every stone in that harbor. If we dock there, we are sitting ducks for any firebearer or light skirmisher he leaves behind. And if we stay there, Iphicrates thought, his mind already mapping the kill zones, we give him the one thing he lacks: time to gather his strength and crush us in the mud. Iphicrates turned to his signal officer, his eyes glinting with a sharp, predatory intent. We do not take the port as a landing force. We use it as a dagger. A dagger, sir? The commander asked, blinking. Signal the fleet, Iphicrates commanded, his voice dropping into a register of absolute authority. 2/3 of our ships will hold station off the coast, making a show of preparing for a beach landing. Let the sails flutter, let the men sharpen their blades in full view of the dunes. We will be loud, we will be obvious, and we will be the bait that keeps Pausanias' eyes glued to the surf. The commander's jaw dropped. And the remaining third? They will drop their sails and break off under the cover of the morning mist, Iphicrates said, pointing to a hidden narrow channel obscured by a bank of sea spray. They will slip into the port while Pausanias is occupied by the threat of our main body. While he focuses on pushing us back into the sea, our port squadron will strike his flank from the city's own doorstep. He thinks he is defending the coast, Iphicrates mused, watching the horizon. He doesn't realize he is already surrounded. Iphicrates signaled to the helmsman, who pulled the tiller hard to maintain a slow, lingering pace that kept them just out of reach of the shore. Signal the captains, stay in formation, keep the noise high, and keep the enemy looking at the sand, Iphicrates ordered, his eyes tracing the terrain where he would eventually anchor his main line. We are not just landing an army today. We are orchestrating a collapse. If the usurper wants to see how the Athenians fight, he will have to decide which threat kills him first: the anvil on the beach or the steel already standing in his own harbor. He felt the deck beneath him, steady and true. One move, he thought. One move to fix him and one move to break him. Make the signals. Let the game begin. The ramparts of Pella were silent, save for the rhythmic, mournful tolling of a single watch bell. Parmenion stood atop the western gate, his cloak heavy with the damp morning mist. Beside him, Antipater leaned against the cold stone, his eyes fixed on the usurper's camp that had, for 3 days, been the source of their slow suffocation. Then the pattern broke. It began with a flicker, a stray torch tossed into a wooden housing. Then a roar of dry timber as the massive siege tower, built with weeks of labor and local timber, blossomed into a towering inferno. Look, Antipater said, his voice devoid of surprise, as if he had been expecting the logic of the move. One by one, the siege engines were succumbing to flame. The catapults, the heavy rams, the protective galleries, Pausanias was turning his own camp into a pyre. The Illyrian mercenaries, usually vocal and restless, were moving with a strange, disciplined urgency, breaking down the perimeter and forming into marching columns. Parmenion watched the firelight dance in the usurper's camp. He didn't see a retreat, he saw a tactical pivot. He knows, Parmenion said, his voice flat. He's received word, Antipater agreed, his gaze tracking the dense columns of infantry forming up and turning away from the city walls. The courier we intercepted 3 days ago, or perhaps one of his own scouts, saw the Athenian sails on the horizon. He isn't fleeing, Parmenion. He's abandoning the siege to meet Iphicrates before the fleet can find an anchor. He's choosing the coast over the city, Parmenion thought, the realization settling over him like a shroud. He's realized that Pella is a tomb if he stays, and a trap if he gets caught between our sallyport and the Athenian phalanx. He knows the coast is where Iphicrates will land, Antipater continued, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He's betting everything on stopping them in the surf. If he breaks the Athenians there, he can return to our gates as a victor. If he stays here, he's a prisoner of his own ambition. He's moving fast, Parmenion noted, watching the vanguard already beginning to march toward the distant shimmer of the Thermaic Gulf. The smoke from those engines is meant to hide the speed of his departure. He wants us to think he's defeated, so we'll be too slow to capitalize on his absence." Antipater turned to him, his expression grim. "Should we open the gates?" A strike now would catch him in the confusion of the march. Parmenion shook his head, his eyes narrowed as he looked toward the horizon, where the Athenian fleet would soon make its presence known. "No, let him go. Let him exhaust his men trying to pin Iphicrates to the sand. If he leaves his back to us, he assumes we are too crippled by starvation to follow. He thinks he has outplayed us," Parmenion mused, his internal calculation ticking over the possibilities. "He thinks he is moving to a battlefield of his own choosing. But he doesn't know about the port." "He's playing for time," Antipater whispered. "No," Parmenion corrected, a thin, dangerous smile touching his lips. "He's playing for his life. And he has no idea that the noose is already tightening around his neck. Let him march, Antipater. By the time he reaches the coast, he'll find that the trap has already been set." The heavy stone slab groaned back into place, sealing the sanctum. The sound, a grinding, tooth-on-bone vibration, left a lingering tremor in the floor that didn't stop. In the dim, dying orange glow of the torches, the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, like a held breath. Eurino, Philena, and the younger princes huddled together, their shadows stretching long and distorted against the weeping masonry. The palace was no longer a home. It had become a tomb, and the ceiling felt as though it were slowly, imperceptibly descending to crush the life out of them. Deep within the subterranean labyrinth, the world narrowed. The air changed. The dry, dusty scent of the upper levels vanished, replaced by a wet, metallic tang, the smell of something ancient and putrid, like blood draining into stagnant water. Philip and Archelaus moved through the dark, their fingers trailing against walls that felt unnervingly like slick, cold skin. Moss, thick and furry, clung to the stone, absorbing the sound of their frantic heartbeats. "This is it," Archelaus whispered. His voice was a thin, raspy thread, swallowed instantly by the gloom. His fingers traced an iron grate that looked less like architecture and more like a rusted, jagged jaw set into the masonry. The drainage outflow. It hasn't been touched since the time of the shadows. But the stone, it's still holding. They carried no light. To carry a torch was to invite the gaze of the darkness. They relied on the moonlight that bled through the ventilation slits, thin, sickly white needles of light that slashed across the darkness, illuminating dust motes that hung in the air like dead skin. The path became a fever dream of mud and treacherous stone, sloping downward into a hollow, sucking earth. With every step, the ground grew softer, turning into a wet, yielding peat that tried to hold onto their boots, a hungry, clinging earth that whispered of things buried long ago. Finally, the tunnel choked and widened into a vault that smelled of deep, drowned things. They crawled out, not into the cool night, but into the suffocating, claustrophobic embrace of the Pella Marshes. The smell struck them like a physical blow, a sickening, intoxicating cocktail of rotting vegetation, brine, and the wet black silt of 1,000 years of decay. Tall, skeletal reeds towered over them, swaying in a wind that didn't seem to reach them, standing like a forest of rusted spears. Above, the sky was a bruised purple, and the city's presence, the frantic clanging of bells and the distant, inhuman roar of the usurper's camp, sounded miles away, muffled and distorted, as if they were listening from the bottom of a deep, dark well. Philip stood still. The marsh around them seemed to breathe, a slow, wet inhalation of mud and gas. In the distance, a bird shrieked, a sharp, ragged sound that ended abruptly, replaced by a splash that echoed for too long. "Do you hear that?" Philip whispered, his hand finding the hilt of his dagger. Archelaus didn't answer. He was staring at the water. Floating in the black, oily sludge, half submerged, were the rotted, skeletal remains of old skiffs, their wooden ribs poking out of the mire like the bleached bones of ancient sea beasts. They drifted in the dark water, silent, impatient, waiting for someone to try and climb aboard. Philip stepped onto a ridge of black muck. He stared toward the gulf, his eyes widening. There, tethered to a rotted pier that looked like a row of blackened, crooked teeth, sat a few flat-bottomed boats. They bobbed gently in the dark water, responding to a current no one could see. "They're waiting for us," Archelaus murmured, his voice tight. "Are they waiting for something else?" Philip replied, shivering. A sudden wet thwack erupted from the reeds behind them, followed by a sound like something heavy dragging itself through the muck, a slow, sucking noise that made the hair on Philip's neck prickle. He spun around, his hand drawing the dagger, his eyes straining against the thick, swirling mist that clung to the water's surface like a shroud. There was nothing there. Just the reeds, shivering in a wind that hadn't stirred the trees. "Did you hear that?" Archelaus hissed, his voice barely a breath. He pulled his cloak tighter, his knuckles white as he gripped a jagged piece of stone he'd salvaged from the tunnel. "Something is out here with us." "Keep moving," Philip commanded, though his own pulse was a frantic hammer in his chest. "Don't look at the water. Don't look at the ripples. Just keep your eyes on the high ground." They navigated the ridge, each step a gamble. The mud gave way beneath them with a sickening liquid sound, as if the earth were trying to pull them down into its cold, prehistoric gut. Every few yards they passed half-sunken logs that looked too much like limbs, and patches of stagnant water that reflected the moon in a way that made it look like a pale, lidless eye staring up from the depths. The silence returned, deeper and more predatory than before. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a held breath, the stillness of a predator waiting for its prey to make one false move. Philip felt the weight of the air pressing against his lungs, heavy with the scent of drowned things. He had the irrational, maddening thought that, if he turned his head too quickly, he would see faces pressed against the surface of the black water, watching, waiting for them to stumble. He forced his gaze forward, his jaw locked, fighting the urge to run and scream, to break the awful stillness of this place. He had to be the anchor. If he broke, the terror would consume them both. With a final, desperate leap over a bubbling patch of mire, he hauled himself up onto a higher, firmer ridge of land, the only stable ground in this undulating graveyard of a marsh. Only then did he exhale, his chest heaving, his boots heavy with the black, clinging mud of the abyss. "We're out," Archelaus breathed, wiping a smear of grime from his forehead. He looked back at the tunnel entrance, a dark, jagged wound in the earth. "We can get the others here. But the marshes are a maze. We won't survive the night if we're spotted." Philip didn't respond immediately. He was scanning the edge of the water where the Lydias channel wound its way through the reeds toward the open sea. He saw the faint dark silhouettes of small, flat-bottomed skiffs, vessels used by the local fishermen to navigate the shallows, tethered to a rotting pier that poked out from the mud. "They are not just fishing boats," Philip murmured, pointing. "They're our bridge to the coast." Archelaus followed his gaze, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the perimeter of the rotting pier. The boats were small, barely enough to hold their group, but they were the only way to bypass the miles of impassable marshland and reach the coastline, where, for all they knew, the usurper was currently drowning the kingdom's salvation. "We don't even know if the Athenians have arrived," Archelaus whispered, his voice jagged. "If they haven't reached the coast, or if they've already been pushed back into the sea. We're just rowing ourselves into a slaughterhouse." Philip shifted, his boots shifting in the oily black muck. He scanned the distant horizon, where the dark line of the sky met the invisible, heaving expanse of the Gulf. There were no signal fires, no glow of burning ships, only the flat and different blackness of the water. "We have to assume they're coming," Philip said, though the uncertainty gnawed at him. The news of the usurper's march from the walls, it had to be for a reason. If they aren't at the coast, then we're stuck in this bog until the usurper decides to scour the marshes for us. It's a choice between the unknown and a grave. "And if we find them?" Archelaus asked, his hand trembling slightly as he reached out to steady a drifting skiff that bumped against a submerged, bloated log. "We are princes of Macedon. We're coming out of a sewer in the dead of night. They'll either kill us on sight or treat us like ghosts." Philip stepped into the shallow water, the cold sludge seeping into his boots, chilling him to the bone. He grabbed the gunwale of the small, flat-bottomed boat, feeling the wood groan beneath his grip. It felt ancient, waterlogged, and fragile, a coffin waiting to be launched. "Then we make them listen," Philip said, his eyes hard and unblinking. "We don't need a welcome. We need a path. If the Athenians are there, we offer them what no one else can, the keys to Pella. If they aren't, then we keep rowing until we find someone who will take a fight to Pausanias." "We need to secure them," Archelaus said, his voice hardening with that same cold, tactical edge Philip possessed. "If we take them, we disappear into the Gulf. If we wait, we're just sitting on a mud bank waiting for the usurper's scouts to find us." Philip nodded, his eyes fixed on the distant dark water. We go back for the others. But we don't bring them to the marsh, we bring them to the boats. Once we're on the water, no army on earth can catch us. He looked back toward the tunnel entrance, the jagged wound in the earth that led back to their terrified kin. We go back for the others, but we do it now. If we wait for the dawn, the marsh will see us, and whatever lives beneath this silt will surely claim us. He pushed off from the pier, the boat sliding silently into the black oily water. It didn't ripple. It seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. Philip stared into the void, his heart hammering against his ribs. The destination was a ghost story, the journey was a descent into madness, and yet, as he gripped the crude oar, he felt a strange, terrifying sense of purpose. They were no longer children of the palace, they were the first to walk the path of their own survival. They turned back toward the tunnel, two silhouettes disappearing into the reeds, leaving the sprawling, treacherous marsh to guard their secret exit from a dying city. To be continued in episode 30, Persia, Golden Scales. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead Dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.